My name is Devin Castellano, and I was 29 years old the night my stepbrother removed my access to a server I built from the ground up in front of 40 people at a barbecue and called it taking back what's ours. He had no idea the entire family business had been running on my code for 3 years. He found out exactly 9 days later, when every invoice, every shipment record, and every dollar his father had ever moved through that company vanished behind a login screen only I controlled. Welcome back to her silent triumph, the channel for the quiet ones who get the last word. If you've ever been written out of something you built with your own hands, you're exactly where you need to be tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's get into it. I should tell you who I was before that barbecue, because the family kept a version of me that was never close to true. I'm a back-end developer. 8 years in the industry, the last 4 spent freelancing for mid-size logistics and distribution companies, the kind of unglamorous businesses that move pallets of inventory across state lines and live or die by whether their systems talk to each other correctly. I'm good at the part nobody sees. Database architecture, API integrations, the invisible plumbing that makes a business actually function instead of just look like it functions. I don't get my name on anything. I get the relief in someone's voice when a system that used to crash twice a week suddenly doesn't. My mother, Renata, remarried when I was 24. Her husband, Carl Brennan, was steady and kind to her in the specific way that made me want to like him, and mostly I did. Carl had a son from his first marriage, Tyler, 2 years younger than me, who I'll be honest about right away, charming in the way certain men are charming when they've never once had to be anything else. Tyler ran the operations side of Carl's company, Brennan Freight Solutions, a regional trucking and warehousing outfit Carl had built up over 22 years from a single truck and a cell phone. I want to be precise about what ran operations meant, because the family said it like a job title that explained everything, the way you'd say doctor or pilot. What it actually meant was that Tyler showed up, made decisions that sounded confident, and let other people absorb the consequences when the decisions were wrong. I'd watched it happen at exactly one Thanksgiving before I understood the pattern completely. Carl mentioning a customer they'd lost, Tyler waving it off. Cheap account anyway. Nobody pushing back. 3 years ago, Carl's company was drowning in exactly the way you'd expect a 20-year-old trucking business run on spreadsheets and a dispatcher's memory to drown. Lost shipments nobody could trace. Invoices billed twice or never billed at all. A warehouse inventory system that was, charitably, a guess. Carl mentioned it at a family dinner the way you mention a leak in the roof you've decided to live with. I asked a few questions out of genuine curiosity, the kind of questions that come naturally when you've spent a career fixing exactly this kind of mess. Carl's eyes lit up in a way I hadn't expected. "Could you actually look at it?" he asked. "Just look, no pressure." I looked. What I found over the next 2 weeks was a company hemorrhaging money through 100 small invisible cuts, the kind no one notices individually, but that add up to a business slowly bleeding out. I didn't say any of that to Carl directly. I just asked if he wanted me to build something better. He said yes before I finished the sentence. I want to be honest about my motivations, because this isn't a story about a selfless stepdaughter rescuing a struggling family business out of love. I liked the problem. It was a genuinely interesting one, and Carl offered to pay me a fair contractor rate, which I needed at the time more than I let on. I built Brennan Freight Solutions an entire internal system from scratch over the following 8 months. A relational database that tracked every shipment, every customer account, every driver's hours, every dollar of inventory sitting in the warehouse. An API layer that connected dispatch to billing to the warehouse floor, so the same number showed up in every system instead of 3 different numbers depending on who you asked. A login portal with role-based permissions, so drivers saw what drivers needed and accountants saw what accountants needed, and nobody saw the whole picture, except the people who were supposed to. I named the server, in the version control history that nobody but me would ever read, Brennan Core. I thought that was a nice gesture. Carl thought it was hilarious when I told him. Tyler never asked. That's the detail I want you to sit with for a second, because it explains everything that came after. Tyler never once in 3 years asked me a single question about how the system worked. He used it every day. He pulled reports from it, complained when it flagged inconsistencies in his numbers, took credit in meetings for efficiency gains the database had generated. But he never once asked who built it, how it worked, or what would happen if the person who built it ever stopped showing up. He thought it was furniture. He thought it had always been there, the way you think a load-bearing wall has always been there until someone takes a sledgehammer to it and you learn what it was actually doing. I kept doing freelance work for other clients during this time, but Brennan Freight became my biggest and steadiest contract. Carl paid me monthly through an actual signed services agreement, the kind with my legal name on it, and a scope of work and a termination clause, because even though he was my stepfather, Carl was a careful businessman who didn't believe in handshake deals, and I respected him enormously for that. I want you to remember that contract. It comes back later, and it comes back loud. The family dynamic around all of this was its own kind of education. My mother was proud of me in the quiet way she's always been proud of things, mentioning it to her sisters on the phone, never quite saying it to my face. Carl was vocally grateful, almost to the point of embarrassing me at dinners, telling anyone who'd listen that his stepdaughter had saved the company. Tyler's reaction to all of this praise was to get smaller and harder at the same time, the way some people do when someone near them succeeds at something they secretly wanted credit for themselves. I noticed it. I didn't do anything about it because what was there to do? I wasn't trying to outshine him. I was doing contract work I was being paid for. But Tyler started referring to his systems in meetings, started describing the database to clients as something the company had developed. Started, in small ways I only pieced together later, writing me out of the story of my own work in real time, the way you sand a signature off a piece of furniture until it just looks like a nice table nobody made. The server access itself tells you everything about how the family actually saw the arrangement. I had full administrative rights, obviously, because I was the one maintaining and updating the system. Carl had admin access too, as the owner. Tyler had operational access, broad but not root level, because he needed to run the business day to day, but had zero technical background and would have broken something within a week if given full control. This was not me being controlling. This was basic professional practice, the same way you don't give the person who can't read code the keys to delete a production database. Tyler hated this arrangement from the day I set it up. He never said it directly. He said it in comments, the kind that sound like jokes until you notice how often they repeat. Must be nice having all the keys. Guess I should learn to code if I want any say in my own company. I let it go each time because I genuinely believed it was harmless grumbling from a guy who didn't love feeling outpaced by his stepsister. I had no idea he'd been quietly building towards something for almost a year. The barbecue was Carl's idea, a celebration for the company's 22nd anniversary, the kind of milestone that matters more to the person who built something from a single truck than to anyone else in attendance. 40-some people in Carl and my mother's backyard on a warm Saturday in late June. Employees and their families, relatives, the kind of gathering where there's a rented tent and a guy doing burgers and somebody's cousin's kids running through a sprinkler. I came because my mother asked me to, and because I genuinely liked Carl and wanted to celebrate something I'd had a real hand in. I brought potato salad. I want that detail in here because it tells you how completely unprepared I was for what was coming. You don't bring potato salad to an ambush. It started around 4 in the afternoon. When Tyler stood up near the dessert table with a beer in his hand and a look on his face, I should have recognized immediately as a man about to perform something he'd rehearsed. "I want to say something," he announced, loud enough that conversation actually stopped, which tells you he'd planned the volume too. 22 years ago, my dad started this company with one truck, and over the past few years, we've really modernized things, gotten our systems together, and I'm proud of the work I've put into that. I felt my stomach do something complicated. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was wrong. "And I think," Tyler continued, looking directly at me now, smiling the way you smile when you're enjoying yourself more than the moment calls for, "it's time we get serious about who has access to what in this company. No offense, Devin, but you're not actually an employee. You're a contractor. And I don't think a contractor should have more control over our systems than the actual operations team. A few people laughed nervously, the way people do when they're not sure if something's a joke. I looked at Carl. Carl looked confused, glancing between Tyler and me like he was trying to figure out if this was a bit he hadn't been told about. Tyler pulled out his phone, theatrically, and I watched in real time as he opened what I'd find out later was the user management panel on a system he had zero authorization to be modifying unsupervised. A panel he'd apparently learned to navigate to exactly one screen, just enough to perform this single action. Effective today, he said, I'm restructuring our access permissions to reflect actual operational roles. He tapped his screen. Done. He'd revoked my administrative access to the server. Not Carl's. Mine. In front of 40 people, with a beer in his other hand, like he'd just announced a promotion instead of committed an act of professional sabotage at a party with potato salad on the table. I want to walk you through exactly what I felt in that moment because it surprised me. It wasn't rage. It was something colder and clearer, the same feeling I get at 2 a.m. when a production system throws an error I haven't seen before. A kind of total, narrowing focus. I did not say anything. I did not pull out my own phone to check what had actually happened, because I already knew what had actually happened, and I knew exactly what it meant. And I knew that reacting visibly in that yard would only give Tyler the audience reaction he was performing for. My mother's face had gone the particular shade of pale that meant she understood enough of what just happened to be embarrassed without fully understanding the scope of it. Carl set down his burger. Tyler, Carl said low, what did you just do? I fixed something that should have been fixed a long time ago, Dad, Tyler said, still riding the high of his own performance. We don't need her anymore. I've been learning the system. I can handle it. I want you to notice something about that sentence, because it's the whole story in miniature. He said he'd been learning the system. He had not been learning the system. He had been learning, at most, how to find one menu and click one button. The difference between those two things was about to become the most expensive lesson of Tyler Brennan's life. I finally spoke. I kept my voice level, the same voice I use when I'm explaining a bug to a client who's panicking and needs someone calm in the room. Tyler, do you understand what you just did? I revoked unnecessary access, he said. It's not personal, Devin, it's just business. I almost laughed. I didn't, because laughing would have been satisfying in the moment and useless for everything after it. Instead, I said the only thing I needed to say in that yard, in front of those 40 people, with my potato salad still sitting untouched on the dessert table. Okay, I said. You're right, it's just business. Then I picked up my purse, told my mother I loved her, told Carl I hoped he had a good rest of the party, and left. I did not slam a gate or storm off dramatically. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories usually go, and I know the satisfying version has me throwing a drink or delivering a perfect comeback speech in the moment. That's not what happened, and it's not what I'm built for. What I'm built for is the version where I go home, sit down at my own laptop, and start documenting. Here's the thing Tyler didn't understand, the thing that separated his entire worldview from mine in one clean line. He thought access and ownership were the same thing. He thought because he could revoke my login, he had taken something from me. What he'd actually done was reveal, in writing, in front of witnesses, that he believed he had the authority to unilaterally restructure a system he did not own, did not build, did not understand, and had zero legal claim over, all because his name happened to share a building with his father's. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind already 3 steps ahead, doing the kind of methodical accounting I do for a living. Not anger, inventory. Here's what most people don't understand about modern business infrastructure, and it's the exact gap Tyler fell into without realizing he was standing over it. When I built Brennan Core, I built it under my own developer account, hosted on infrastructure I personally provisioned and paid for through my freelance business, because that's standard practice for an independent contractor building proprietary software for a client. Carl's company didn't own a server. Carl's company had a service agreement with me, Devin Castellano, doing business as an independent contractor, for the development, hosting, and maintenance of a software system that ran their operations. The contract, the actual signed contract Carl insisted on 3 years earlier, because he was a careful man, specified exactly this. I retained ownership of the underlying codebase and infrastructure. Brennan Freight Solutions had a license to use the system for the duration of our service agreement, with monthly payments, and a defined process for either party to terminate that agreement, including a transition period for data migration if they ever wanted to move to a different system or bring development in-house. Tyler had not terminated that agreement. Tyler did not have the authority to terminate that agreement. Only Carl, as the actual signatory, could do that, and even then, only through the process specified in writing. Tyler had simply logged into a panel. He half understood and clicked a button that removed my administrative privileges from a system that I, not Brennan Freight Solutions, legally owned and operated. What Tyler had actually done, in the eyes of the contract Carl himself had signed, was attempt unauthorized administrative action on a contractor's proprietary system by a person with no authority to modify the service agreement, in direct violation of its terms. I want to be honest with you about the next 9 days, because I didn't spend them plotting revenge in the way the word usually implies. I spent them doing exactly what I do for every client when something goes wrong with a system. I documented. I am, by training and temperament, a person who keeps records. It's the only language I've ever fully trusted, because code doesn't lie to you and timestamps don't change their story under pressure. The first thing I did when I got home was pull up the server's access logs. Every system I build logs administrative actions automatically, timestamped, tied to the user account that performed them, because that's just good practice for any production system handling financial data. I didn't even have to dig. There it was, clean and undeniable. A login from Tyler's operational account, a navigation path to the user permissions panel, a single modification event removing my admin role, time-stamped to 4:17 p.m. that Saturday, roughly 2 minutes after he'd started his speech by the dessert table. I screenshotted it. I exported the full log entry. I saved it in 3 places, because that's a habit you develop fast in this industry, the same way nurses chart everything twice. Then I did something I want to walk you through carefully, because it's the part of this story people sometimes misunderstand as cruelty when it was actually just precision. I did not shut anything down. I did not delete anything. I did not lock Carl or anyone else out of the system that night or the next day or the day after that. The company still needed to function. Drivers still needed their dispatch information. Invoices still needed to go out. And punishing 40 employees and 100 customers for Tyler's tantrum was never something I considered, even briefly. What I did instead was simply restore my own access, because I had root-level control of infrastructure I owned. And Tyler's button-click had about as much actual power over that as flipping a light switch in a house he didn't have the deed to. The system kept running exactly as it had. I just made sure, quietly, that nobody could do that again without going through me first. Then I called Carl. This is the part I think about most, because it's where the story could have gone a different way if Carl had been a different kind of man. I called him the Monday after the barbecue, not to yell, not to demand an apology, but to explain calmly and factually what had happened and what it meant, the same way I'd explain a security vulnerability to any client. Carl, I said, I need to walk you through something, and I need you to listen all the way through before you respond, because this is more serious than I think Tyler understands. Carl, to his credit, listened. I explained the ownership structure of the system, the same way I'd explained it to him 3 years earlier when we signed the contract, because apparently that detail had gotten lost somewhere in the day-to-day of running the business. I explained that Tyler's action on Saturday was not a personnel decision. It was an unauthorized attempt to modify a contractor's system outside the terms of the agreement Carl himself had signed. I explained that the only reason the company hadn't experienced any disruption was because I'd absorbed the situation quietly out of respect for him, and for the employees who depended on the system, not because Tyler's action had been harmless. There was a long silence on the line. Then Carl said the sentence that told me he genuinely hadn't known. "I had no idea he did that at the party. Renata told me you left early, but she didn't say why." He revoked my admin access in front of 40 people and announced he didn't need me anymore, I said. Then he sat down and ate cake. Another silence, longer this time. "I'm going to need a few days to handle this properly," Carl said finally. "Can you give me that?" I told him he could have whatever time he needed, because I genuinely believed Carl would handle it properly, and because 9 days wasn't going to change anything about the facts already sitting in a log file with a timestamp on it. What I didn't know yet was what Tyler was doing during those same 9 days, riding the high of his own performance, telling people at the company that he'd streamlined things, that they were moving toward doing this in-house. Whatever that meant to a man who couldn't tell you the difference between a database and a spreadsheet if his life depended on it. I found this out from Marisol, the company's longtime dispatcher, who'd worked for Carl since the single truck days and who called me directly on day 6, sounding worried in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Devin, I don't know if I should be telling you this," she said, "but Tyler's been talking to some guy he met at a Chamber of Commerce thing, some IT consultant. He's telling people we're switching systems. Is that true? Because half the drivers don't know what's going on and the invoices for last week still haven't gone out." This was the moment I understood the full shape of what Tyler had actually started, and it was both more reckless and more revealing than I'd initially assumed. He hadn't just made an impulsive power move at a barbecue. He'd been quietly shopping for a replacement system behind his father's back, presumably for weeks before the party, and the barbecue announcement wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was the opening move of a plan he thought he'd already set in motion, a plan that hinged entirely on him believing he could simply transfer the company's operational data to a new system whenever he felt like it, the same way you'd switch streaming services. What Tyler did not understand, because Tyler had never once asked a single technical question in 3 years, is that the data inside Brennancore was not sitting in some exportable spreadsheet waiting to be copied. It was structured, relational, deeply interconnected data, living inside infrastructure that I owned and controlled, governed by a contract that specified exactly how a transition like that would need to happen, with my cooperation, on a timeline we'd agree to, with appropriate compensation for the migration work involved. I called Carl again that evening, and this time I didn't soften anything. "Carl, I need you to understand something. Tyler is telling employees you're switching systems. He's apparently been talking to outside consultants. If he tries to do that without going through the proper transition process in our contract, he's not going to lose access to a server. He's going to lose access to 22 years of operational history, customer records, billing data, everything, because none of that exists anywhere except inside a system I own, and that he has no legal right to extract without my cooperation." Carl's voice, when he finally spoke, had gone very quiet. He told me he had it handled. "He doesn't have anything handled," I said. "He has a Chamber of Commerce business card and a button he clicked at a barbecue." Carl asked me to come to the office the following Monday, 9 days after the barbecue, for what he called a real conversation with Tyler there, where we settle this properly. I agreed, because I wanted this settled properly too, just not in the way Tyler imagined. Here is where I have to tell you about the one thing I did do during those 9 days that could fairly be called preparation rather than pure documentation, because I think it matters for you to understand the difference between defending yourself and attacking someone. I did not touch a single piece of company data. I did not threaten to delete anything, lock anyone out beyond restoring my own legitimate access, or hold the business hostage. What I did was simple, and I'd argue exactly what any reasonable contractor would do when a client unilaterally violates a signed agreement. I had my own attorney, a woman named Priya Oduya who handles contract law for independent tech consultants, review everything. The access logs, the original service agreement, Tyler's specific action and its timestamp. She read through it in about 20 minutes and told me, in the calm, slightly amused voice of someone who deals with exactly this kind of dispute regularly, that Tyler's action constituted a clear breach attempt with no legal weight whatsoever, since he had no authority under the contract to modify it, and that I was well within my rights to restrict access to anyone without my explicit authorization, until the matter was resolved with Carl directly. I asked her one specific question before that Monday meeting. If they try to take the data and move it somewhere else without going through me, what actually happens? Legally, she said, they'd be in breach of the agreement, and depending on how they extracted it, possibly looking at issues around unauthorized access to your proprietary systems, since the infrastructure is yours. Practically, if they don't have your cooperation and don't understand the architecture, they're not getting clean data. They're getting whatever fragments they can scrape manually, which for a relational system tracking 3 years of shipments, billing, and inventory is going to look like nothing useful at all. I want to pause here for a second, because I know some of you watching have been in a version of this room before, where someone who never once asked how the machine works decides they're entitled to drive it anyway, simply because their name is on the building. If that's you, stay with me, because what happened in that conference room is exactly the kind of quiet reckoning I think you came here for. Monday morning, I walked into Brennan Freight Solutions' small conference room wearing the same kind of plain, professional clothes I'd wear to any client meeting, because that's exactly what this was. Carl sat at the head of the table looking like he hadn't slept well in days. Tyler sat across from me, and I want to describe his expression carefully, because it told me everything about how he'd spent the previous 9 days. He looked confident. He looked like a man who believed he'd already won this argument before it started, the same energy he'd carried at the dessert table, except now it had curdled slightly at the edges into something defensive, like he'd caught wind that the ground underneath him wasn't as solid as he'd assumed, but hadn't yet admitted that to himself. So, Tyler said, before Carl could even open the meeting, I talked to a guy, Marcus Feld, runs an IT firm downtown, does this kind of work for half the businesses in the industrial park. He says transitioning our systems over is totally doable. Couple weeks, tops. Did Marcus Feld look at the actual database architecture? I asked. He doesn't need to see the inside of it, Tyler said, with the easy confidence of a man who genuinely believed software was something you could just point a new vendor at and have them magically absorb. He just needs the data. Export it, import it, done. I opened my laptop. I'd prepared exactly one document for this meeting, because I'd learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing in a room like this isn't a speech. It's paper. I turned my laptop to face the table and pulled up the access log from the day of the barbecue, the clean time-stamped record of Tyler's login and his single unauthorized modification. This is the action you took on June 21st, I said, keeping my voice exactly as level as it had been in that backyard. 4:17 p.m., you logged into the operational panel and revoked my administrative access. I want to read you the relevant section of the contract your father signed 3 years ago, the one that governs this system. I read it aloud, slowly, the way you read something into a record. The section establishing my ownership of the infrastructure and codebase. The section defining Brennan Freight's license to use the system, contingent on the monthly service agreement remaining active. The section, specifically, outlining that any termination or modification of access required written notice from the contracting party, Carl, not Tyler, with a 30-day transition window for data handoff if the relationship ended. You have no signing authority on this contract, I said to Tyler. You're not a party to it. What you did on June 21st wasn't a personnel decision. It was an attempt to unilaterally alter a legal agreement you have no standing in, performed on infrastructure you don't own, using a login you were given solely for operational use, not administrative control. Tyler's face did something complicated, somewhere between annoyance and the first flicker of genuine alarm. It's still our company's data, he said. I don't care whose name is on some server somewhere. It's not your company's data, I said, and I let that sentence sit in the room exactly as long as it needed to. It's data your company has a license to use, under terms your father agreed to, for as long as that agreement remains in effect. If you want to migrate to a different system, that's entirely your right. But it goes through the transition clause, with my cooperation, on a timeline we agree to, at a rate reflecting the actual work involved in safely extracting and structuring 3 years of relational data, so it doesn't break the moment it leaves my infrastructure. This is insane, Tyler said, looking at Carl now. Dad, tell her this is insane. We built this company, she's a contractor. This is the moment I want you to really sit in, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. I watched Carl, a man who'd spent 22 years building something out of a single truck, look at his son with an expression I can only describe as exhausted clarity, the look of someone finally seeing a pattern they'd been avoiding for a long time. Tyler, Carl said quietly, she's not just a contractor. She's the reason this company didn't fold 3 years ago. I told you that. I told you that multiple times. You always take her side, Tyler said, and there it was, the real engine underneath everything, finally exposed in a conference room with fluorescent lighting and a half-empty coffee pot. This had never really been about access permissions. It had been about a man who'd spent 3 years watching his stepsister get credit and competence handed to her by his own father, in a business Tyler had assumed, simply by birthright, was supposed to be his story to tell. Carl didn't raise his voice. That's the part I respected most about how this ended. I'm not taking sides, Tyler. I'm looking at a contract I signed, and a server log with your name on it, and an employee who called me last week worried about whether she still has a job because invoices stopped going out for a week while you were talking to consultants instead of running dispatch. Marcus said. Marcus doesn't know what he's looking at, I said, because nobody showed him anything except the idea of a database. Tyler, with respect, you don't know what you're looking at either. You've used this system every single day for 3 years and you've never once asked me how it works. That's fine. You don't have to know how it works. But you can't make decisions about infrastructure you've never understood, especially infrastructure that doesn't belong to you. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when the loudest person in it has finally run out of things to say that sound true. Tyler looked at his father. His father looked back at him with something that wasn't anger anymore, just a kind of tired, settled disappointment, the expression of a man finally doing the arithmetic he'd been avoiding for years. Here's what's going to happen, Carl said finally, and I watched him become, in real time, the man who'd actually built this company from nothing, the version of him I think Tyler had genuinely never had to face before. Devon's access stays exactly as it was, full administrative rights like we agreed 3 years ago. Tyler, you're going to apologize to her, and you're going to apologize to Marisol and the dispatch team for the disruption you caused without telling anyone, and you're going to drop whatever you've been doing with this Marcus person, because we are not migrating anything anywhere without Devon's cooperation and a real plan, not a guy from a Chamber of Commerce mixer. Tyler's jaw tightened, and if I don't... Carl looked at him for a long moment. Then we need to have a very different conversation about what your role here actually is, because right now I'm not sure you understand the difference between running operations and owning the company. One of those is a job. The other one is mine. I want to tell you Tyler apologized graciously in that room, and everything resolved into a heartwarming family reconciliation. That's not what happened, and I think you'll trust this story more for the honesty of saying so. Tyler apologized in the flattest, most grudging tone a person can manage while technically using the right words, the kind of apology that's really just surrender wearing a costume. Fine, sorry, whatever. I just thought after everything I'd have more say in things. You can have say in things, I told him, because I genuinely wasn't trying to humiliate him further, just to close the loop honestly. You run operations. That's real and it matters. But running operations and owning infrastructure are different jobs, and pretending otherwise almost cost this company a week of broken invoices and 40 drivers who didn't know what was happening with their dispatch. He didn't respond to that. He just nodded once, the kind of nod that doesn't mean agreement, just exhaustion with the conversation, and left the room without finishing his coffee. Here's how it actually landed in the weeks after, because I think you deserve the real follow-through, and not just the conference room moment. Carl had Priya, my attorney, draft a clarifying amendment to our service agreement, explicit now about administrative authority resting solely with me and any termination or transition requiring his written authorization specifically, not Tyler's, not anyone else's. I didn't ask for that. Carl insisted on it, because I think some part of him needed it written down as much as I did, a way of formally closing a door that had briefly swung open at a barbecue. Marisol got a raise and an actual title, Director of Operations, the kind of recognition that should have happened years earlier, and finally did, because the whole incident forced Carl to look hard at who'd actually been holding the company together day to day, while his son collected the credit. Tyler stayed at the company, technically. His role got quietly, specifically narrowed over the following months, fewer client meetings, fewer moments where he got to describe systems he didn't build as though they were his idea. I don't know exactly how that conversation went between him and Carl, because it wasn't mine to be part of, and I didn't ask. What I know is that he never tried anything like the barbecue stunt again, and the few times I saw him at family gatherings after that, he was quieter, the specific kind of quiet that comes from a person who got measured publicly and came up short and hasn't yet figured out what to do with that information except sit with it. My mother apologized to me weeks later, in the kind of low, private conversation she's always preferred to any public one. She said she should have said something at the barbecue instead of just going pale and staying silent. I told her I understood why she hadn't, and I meant it. Some moments call for a calm response delivered later with documentation, not a shouted defense in the moment. And I think on some level she'd recognized that even as it was happening, recognized that I was already handling it the only way I know how to handle anything that actually matters. People sometimes ask me, when this story comes up, whether I ever considered actually pulling the plug, locking everyone out, making Tyler feel for one day what it's like to run a company with no system underneath it at all. I won't pretend the thought never crossed my mind in the rawest version of that first hour, standing in my own kitchen with my potato salad still in its container on the counter. But that was never actually the plan, because punishing 100 customers and 40 employees for one man's ego was never going to be the point. The point was always just this: showing up calmly with the facts, in writing, time-stamped, undeniable, and letting the truth do the only kind of arguing I've ever trusted. Tyler thought blocking my login was an act of power. It was actually a confession, recorded automatically by a system he never once asked a single question about, made by a man who genuinely believed that being someone's son meant the work itself didn't matter. He found out, in a conference room with bad coffee, that it does. It always does. I still maintain Brennancore today. The contract's still active, the company's still running, and Carl still introduces me at company events as the person who saved this business. Except now, he says it loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, including Tyler, every single time. That's my story. One barbecue, one button click, and one server log that did all the talking I never had to raise my voice to do. If someone in your life has ever mistaken access for ownership, mistaken a title for actual understanding, let this be your reminder that the people who quietly build things are usually the ones holding the keys that matter, whether anyone else notices or not. If this story hit home for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.